Fellow Rebels, here in the dungeon with me today is a member of the OG Rebellion. She's one of the big three. She was the other half that started it all. She was responsible for the spark that lit the roleplay afire, or rather the claws that sent the roleplay into cardiac arrest. Her artwork is vast and appallingly good. She's responsible for the official BotGD wiki, the formal fanfiction version of the original threads, and the animated video that is putting this fandom on the map. People of the Grounded Dungeon, I give you Tree Pelt.
Oh, well, you make me blush.
Well, I'm only telling the truth. So, Tree, thank you for joining me today in my cell. But now I think the first question I need to ask you, is this more of we're two rebels sitting in a cell, or I'm the rebel still chilling out here and you're the warden?
You're definitely sitting in the cell and I'm outside of it.
Yeah.
You're just passing my time for amusement right now, so.
My door is locked today and the warden is right where she usually is. That is perfect. So, just, wanted to say, I had a blast making a StoneGit YouTube account and leaving comments on your video.
Oh, I enjoyed that very much.
I had a right good time with that, because the first I was like, I'll just clarify for people who, sent something a month ago and still might be waiting for a response, but after a certain point I'm like, no, there's only 200 comments. I'm gonna answer all of them.
Is that what you actually did? I only saw a couple of your comments.
Yeah, I scrolled down, I didn't go bananas with it, but whenever there was a really obstinate either, no, this is how to train your dragon no matter what you say, or just a real,
there's a lot of those.
Yeah, or just the real clear who's the bad guy is the one that I answered. It's that's the first thing you tell people in the description. And while we're on that subject, I cannot tell you how flattering it is that you chose a scene where my muse was one of the central topics of it for something that you didn't just draw, but you animated it. You made frames and frames of these characters. Your wrist is probably dead.
It was. I get a man possessed when I start a project like that, and I think that thing only took me, it couldn't have been more than 3 or 4 days from beginning to end, so.
I beg your pardon?
That might be exaggerating. I made all the frames during the day, and then I stayed up until probably 3 or 4 a.m. putting it all together on this video editing website, and then I paid $3 to download it without the watermark, and then I uploaded it to YouTube the next day.
Tree, if I made 30 seconds worth of animation in 3 days, my wrist bones would be sticking out the top of my hand.
It's all stamina. I'm not classically trained, but I'm definitely used to doing very long sprints of art. It's probably Battle of the Grounded Dungeon's fault, as I just draw for hours and on hours just because I was obsessed with it, so.
I feel you there.
to the art speed running lifestyle, so.
Yeah, art was never something that I could really pull off, so as soon as I drew something that was even moderately good, I felt like I had just run a marathon. But then there are people like you that can just, have almost an inexhaustible supply of top-notch stuff, and now apparently the animation that is 3 minutes long took about 3 or 4 days to finish. Well, okay, yeah. I don't feel inadequate now. All right. So, and there's elements of that where we'll get into that in future questions, but yeah, just wanted to put that out there. Super flattered, stoked, can't believe I missed it for 10 months.
That's good. Well, that means you just came back to it when it was all blowing up, so that's even better.
I mean, that is nice. It showed up around the same time that the chat kicked into gear, which was great.
Right.
So perhaps this is a bit of overtly well-known history, but I figure for the sake of formality and hearing it from your mouth, it's an important question to ask everyone who joins me here in the dungeon. And What is your BOTGD discovery story? Like, how did this all start for you?
Shit, okay, so I was in it. Everyone else's story is like, I saw Haddock, doing this role play, and then I made a character, and then I joined. But that was not even close to where I start. Because, let me actually get some posts to supplement my story, because mine started with, basically with the release of How to Train Your Dragon 2, I would assume. And then, because how I tell people who have no idea what Battle of the Grounded Dungeon is How to Train Your Dragon 2 released, and because we're a masochistic fandom, we start making jokes about Stoic dying to deal with it. And I've always been the person to, like, whenever someone tells a bad pun, to be like, shut up, and, like, I'll be the one person that's annoyed with the joke while everyone else has a good time. But I have fun with that, like, social role. So that kind of escalated into me being this well-known police figure for Stoic jokes. And we started this list of people that were making sad headcanons and whatnot, and I would, and I went into a total drama queen. I was like,
oh, absolutely.
No, you guys are absolutely all locked in the dungeon here with me. So, I'm trying to think. There was some, like, slightly in character standoffs between me and Peach Doxy, and then me and Haddock, which I'd known Peach for a while, but I had no clue who Haddock was, and I'm not even sure how I hadn't come across Haddock yet in the fandom. I might have reblogged a post or, like, an analysis or some such, but I had no idea who Haddock was. It was just this person. That's how it was for most of the people I engaged with, but it was lots of fun. So my official indictment, I suppose, was when Haddock, totally in secret, goes and messages everyone who's been involved, tells them to message me, saying that they're breaking out of this fictional dungeon that we'd created. And I get home from choir practice, and it looks like a nuclear explosion has gone off across my dashboard, my inbox, my messages, my everything. And I just sat there all night, like, just laughing, because it was the biggest thing I had ever seen done, and it just spiraled off from there into characters and settings and story and what it is today, basically. So mine was a very gradual descent from meta to roleplay, I suppose.
It's almost like you got to walk down the stairs, whereas everyone else tripped over the banister and crashed into the basement.
Yeah. Everyone else just kind of took the leap, and I was there the whole time holding this roleplay's hand. So.
And from what I can tell, based on your introductory statement, you haven't let go, and for that I'm extremely thankful.
Well, good. I'm glad.
Well, it's a very particular sense of comfort to me, because for one thing, I always seem to notice how the truth of Battle of the Grounded Dungeon often reflects the truth of real life between the Muns and the Muses. It was a learning experience for a lot of people, and we'll get into that a little bit later. But the parallel that I notice is, just as the Warden is taking care of the rebellion in the fictional universe, you are very much taking care of this rebellion in the real world. And that gives me a sense of comfort, a good feeling of happiness, because it also helps that I get to see and witness someone who's just as obsessed about this as I am.
That is one of the best feelings, yeah. And that's why I stick with it, because everyone is so into this.
Yeah.
As much as they can be. So that fuels my fire to sit down and pick up a pen and doodle a angsty sketch of Lost Pelt and send it out, and make everyone
Oh,
cry. So
my. Speaking of Lost Pelts, so this is the spark comment that I made. From what I noticed, from my perspective looking back, now I didn't join until after the fact of what happened with Vox occurred. But it wasn't too hard to look back at the most recent posts and go, oh, that's what happened. But what I noticed, the sentiment that I got is that everything was fairly just sporadic. It was Muns fighting Muns. There weren't a whole lot of actual solidified muses until the day you stabbed Vox in the chest. And then it seemed that
it was a weird. It was a line between. You would have to ask everyone individually how into it they were at the time, because I was pretty into it. I was still figuring out what characters were, while still being pretty dramatic and like, oh my god, this is still going type thing.
Yeah.
And in a good way. And I remember that we at least had established like personalities at the very least. I think Vox was still kind of being himself, and then I had just solidified the idea that Tree was not the warden, that they were like two separate beings.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was Vox's idea, because he messages me, and we were in the middle of it, because Tumblr was garbage back then, so you had to send asks. So
Back then?
Yeah. It's a lot better now with private messages. If we had private messages back then like we did now, I think everything, like the plotting would have happened a lot better. But
oh, hell yeah.
We did what we could in the past. And so he messages me and he's like, hey, you want to up the drama? You should kill me. All right.
That bastard!
This is who I'm dealing with. So I was like, sure. And so we staged this Toothless Found scene, and I kill him, and that felt like another step off into madness, because everyone's like, oh no, you know.
It was a fucking beehive after that, because
there was a funeral, and yeah.
Because I know, like, for me, I looked and I'm like, wait, these are actual real characters, and now one of them just got fucked, killed. Probably should specify. Yeah. Given this roleplay, I should definitely specify between fucked and killed.
It happened at some point, but go on.
Yeah, but so like that was, I just, it was interesting to see the perspective you had, because I know that's when it got real for me. That seems to be when it got real for a lot of people, where it was like, wow, the Vox Scout died. Now what's my character with their role going to do with this terrifying demon that's running around with her?
Oh, yeah, no, it provided a catalyst for conflict, and it raised the stakes, basically. What is this demon willing to do to everyone else? And then when you start thinking like that, you're like, oh, it's a story now. Oh, okay. So you start treating it as a role play, and so that's when everyone who wanted to be in was like, all right, we're doing this,
That's when I jumped in. When I realized that there was a character in a story that was happening, I was like, hey, maybe I should just join this rebellion now. And even though that happened, one of the most confusing things for me early on was that Tree was the warden, but also not. And it honestly took me a whole lot longer to figure that out than it should have.
I wouldn't even blame you there, because I intentionally I tried to keep the demon secret for as long as I could. Even once I figured it out, I was hinting extremely heavily at it, but I never outright said anything, like used any specific tropes that people would be like, oh, it's a demon. Like, I tried to make it very like, oh, maybe she's going insane, maybe this is actually her, or
you sneak.
Maybe she was never Tree all along. So I definitely muddied the waters very hard there until the Vox scene, and then I think I started explaining. I think after that I started explaining the story in meta instead of keeping it all like this big, what's going on, which was good for the first little bit, but then people actually wanted to buckle down and make characters, and I'm like, okay, I have to actually, like, explain what's going on.
Right. And it was good that you had some time to solidify some of that before that moment happened. Because I know that, for a lot of people, the characters kind of took the wheel and said, I'm either doing this or I am this, and there's nothing you can do about it. And so, just usually in the part of the podcast, and I say usually in the part of the podcast, pretending like I don't only have one other episode outside of this one, that I like to do is like, what are some of your favorite moments where Tree or the Warden just absolutely snatched the wheel out of your hands and careened the car off of a cliff that they really wanted to go down?
The biggest one I can think of was probably just the fact that the Warden got a redemption arc.
Really?
Is probably, and I wouldn't say she completely took the wheel out of my hands, but it was kind of like, because that started early on with Stonkin. That started in season 2. Season 1, I was playing the full, pardon me. And I, was playing with the idea, I didn't know it was going to go past season 1, first of all, so I was playing with this, like, oh, maybe the demon learned her lesson at the end of season 1, and then it kept going, and it was like season 2, and I'm like, oh, I guess I have to, like, figure out where this leaves her. And she was still a dick, but she still very much was an asshole to Stonegate, especially. She's like, oh, I'm still here, you know, like, but I think in my character interview type thing that where I answered all those questions, I mentioned that I like the trope of the villain and the hero getting stuck together and they have to work out something else besides killing each other. So that was really fun. So I just it was more like a series of weird left turns that suddenly I found myself on Friendship Street and I was like, okay, I can do something with this. And then by season 3, it's this full out, like, maybe I actually care about everyone this whole time type thing. So
and
that was more like just an unforeseen ending to what I didn't have planned,
right? Type
thing. And Tree was pretty predictable for the most part because she's very bad. I made her do a lot in the beginning, so from then on it was more like a reactionary thing. I didn't want her to steal the spotlight too much after that because she was basically in the spotlight for all of season 1, so I kind of just let her do her thing for the rest of it. So
yet it's interesting because she always held there was always a retention of interest with her character because even though she may not have been in the spotlight of season 1, her entire coping process that goes beyond that just like encapsulated the rest of the seasons. Like there was this interest in seeing how Tree was actually going to come to terms with everything, and that was extremely interesting to watch as the story progressed.
Yeah, I tried to, especially since the Warden's Redemption arc came to the forefront, I tried to make Tree a kind of like a gateway to the Rebels' trauma, just to be like, because not everyone was, I guess, say interested in that, which is totally fine. You guys were all off having adventures, so I took Treefell and I was like, she's had enough adventure for one day.
One day.
I think I'm going to, for a lifetime. And she just became like this person to figure out her struggles with, and her point of view was always from someone who had been basically tortured by this demon and now has to rub shoulders with her.
Right.
So figuring out where she stands with that and sort of using her as a what's the word? As a fulcrum for how everyone else reacted type thing. So which I wouldn't say was happening very actively at the time, but looking back on it now, I can see I was like, oh, I want to assume this role for her.
Yeah. And going back what you were talking about with perhaps seeing that the demon learned her lesson in season 1 and then being like, oh shit, wow, season 2's here now. Reading back on it, going through the fan fiction and refreshing my knowledge of season 1, which was only half developed at the time. I even though that happened by accident, it almost seems intricately orchestrated, at least in my mind. because, in other words, I appreciate what happened with the character because I've seen with a lot of people, and even with myself, where there'll be a serious issue, usually someone being a dick in some way, shape, or form. They realize that there's a problem. They start to come around, but then all of a sudden there's a turn and they realize they're not out of the woods with that same struggle. And that's an it was a very relatable situation, seeing the warden kind of be like, wow, maybe I wasn't doing a good thing here, and then half a season later steal off Haddock's body, leaving Stonegate bloody to death in a courtyard, and torturing his mind and his entire family's mind, and only really being like, oh shit, maybe I shouldn't have done that, after she sees Stonegate later going, what the fuck?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and in that way,
I love that.
I definitely wanted a non-linear progression of transgressions, and then feeling bad, and then asking for forgiveness, and then you fuck it up again. But I also tried to keep this element of definitely not maybe something a human would do is fuck up that bad after apologizing so much.
Yeah.
My biggest example comes to mind is snapping Haddock's back at the end of season 5.
Mm-hmm.
And then even then I was immediately afterwards, she's like, oh, I should not have done that.
Yeah, oh shit.
But I tried to I liked this element of an immortal trying to figure out how to think like a human type thing, while also still making very human mistakes, making relatable mistakes that someone outside of the world reading would be like, oh, I've done that,
Right.
Told myself I wouldn't do that again and again and again. I did it anyways, and maybe helping whoever reads it sort of, I don't know, see it from a different perspective, that you're not just gonna make a big mistake and then go, I'm sorry, and then everyone says it's okay, and then you're just good from then on. It's this
right.
It's this constant. It's always this back and forth. So.
And that's why I really we probably will, but I love the early stage of the Warden and Stonegate's relationship, but it's the later stage at the end of the story, but not quite into BotGD 2 or EU range, where it's definitely not okay. Not even the torture of even Haddock's torture was still not okay, and then it's just compounded with him getting paralyzed. And the story basically ends with Stonegate being like, I just don't he's distraught because he's caught in the place where he has made mistakes with someone who was not very forgiving, which was Haddock, hating that feeling, and then finding himself in the inverted situation with the Warden, where she's totally fucked up and he is pissed beyond knowing what to do, but he still can't bring himself to be a dick to her. And so I kind of like how the story is, how BotGD 1 doesn't end with a whole, oh, everything's okay now. It ends more with I really want everything to be okay, but it's not. And it's going to be a while before
it's where do we go from here?
Right.
Standpoint.
Because he's just he's pissed about he gets pissed about the torture, but then he's just devastated about the compounded issue of the paralyzation. Paralyzation.
Sure.
I don't know if I said either of those words right, but we're going on.
It's okay. Neither. I feel like the story is good about. It never just explicitly says someone. Well, people do things that are in the wrong, but the emotions and the fallout of that afterwards are rarely. This person is definitely, thinking wrong and is the worst person ever, and this person is right in the argument. Everyone has very valid reactions and emotions to things that happen, and that probably just comes from every character being backed by a different person.
Yes.
And nobody wants to. Okay, I was about to say nobody wants to be the bad guy. I'm talking to the person that proves me wrong on that.
I have no idea what you're talking about, Tree. Please go on with your normal point.
And so everyone wanting to at least do some right by their character adds this very valid human element to most of the conversations and most of the situations. So that's something I really enjoy about role playing.
Yes, and because it's like, because it can always be frustrating when someone tries to make their character perfect or, you know, infallible or anything like that, because it's a very tempting thing to do. You're putting your best foot forward in the fantasy, and because of that, it's hard to, in a sense, swallow a certain amount of pride and make your character deeply flawed. And I think that's one of the reasons why BotGD is pretty awesome, because it's everyone not giving a single care if their character is flawed. They're going forward with it anyway, and for some reason, instead of creating a mess, it created something pretty spectacular.
Yeah. Oh yeah, for sure.
Well, I'm checking what I have on my list of things. So one of the things I'd like to ask is, did you ever imagine that this story, this micro fandom would just turn into what it is today? Did that thought ever cross your mind? Like, you know, let's just say by the time we realized it was going to be a season 2, did it ever occur to you that it was going to be like this?
By the time season 2, yes. And then just the fact that it would turn into a thing like it did probably didn't hit me until halfway through season 1. And even then I was like, oh, we're gonna do this thing, and then it's gonna be over in like 3 months, and then we're all gonna laugh about it like in the fandom later in the future. And then I'm sitting here in 2019 still writing it, so I don't think there's any way to predict that.
No.
But I did feel, if only just because I knew I was up to my neck in it, I was like, okay, this is going to be like a thing for a while, longer than most of the other things have been, you know, but then it'll be over. And then that was just because I was expecting people to just get bored. But we stuck it out all the way through Ragnarok, which is something I can't commend everyone more for, because it was a lot. And then even we had stuff after Ragnarok, and then we finished it out. So. And
then we started it right back up again.
And then we picked it back up again because we were bored, and we were like, "Hey, crew, let's write more." And I think that's just testament to the place in everyone's hearts for the story. So that's really neat.
For sure. And I do have to give credit where credit is due. I don't think it's just a matter of people being bored. Your video got everyone's attention, like holy shit kind of attention. It was a huge blast from the past that just reminded everybody about how much they loved it, how many chills people got just by doing certain scenes and bringing certain plots into fruition.
For sure.
So that credit's definitely there. And then I think Greg was the one who put together the actual Discord channel like a sane human being, instead of the insanity that was all the other chat rooms that we tried to do, and even Skype groups. Holy crap. Did Discord just not exist back then, or were we all just being dumb?
Discord did not exist back then. At the very least, it did not exist it might have been in beta, but I hadn't heard of it. I didn't know anything about it. I think it only came to being in college, so we did not have access to the organization tools that we have now, which some would say is not a bad thing, but it certainly is nice.
I'll give us a pass then. So that ties into checking my list. Okay, there it is. So where it started and where it came from, everyone has the learning experiences. They got something out of themselves through these characters in the story. What are some of those moments with you where you're like, I would not have discovered this, or this wouldn't have happened, or anything like that, because of BotGD?
Oh, Lord. So, a really weird experience for me is that a lot of the things I said my characters were going through at the time I wrote them didn't happen to me until like 2 or 3 years later.
Really?
And that was a very strange experience. not like a deja vu thing, but it was more. It was kind of like, oh, I was exploring this when I was still in high school, and then, just mostly the experience of growing up and moving away and, dealing with things basically by myself, which I hadn't done for a while, but once I was out in the world, moved away for school, I learned there was a lot of things I could do, and I learned there was a lot of things I could absolutely not do, so.
Right.
And I kind of had Battle of the Grounded Dungeon as a medium to explore how I felt when I was younger, still a teenager, and then as a medium to coping mechanisms is probably a little much, but just
coping mechanisms can be small and moderated. It works.
Yeah, and it just an avenue to explore emotions.
Yeah.
I think for me. And so, which I went through a lot, like a ton has changed for me between now and then. So, the story of the warden changing so much, especially, helped me with just like already being okay with turning into a completely different person. Because I was like, I mean, she turned out all right, so this can't be that bad.
If the D-Man can't pull it off.
Yeah, I think that was the biggest thing to take away from that, and then the project as a whole just kind of creatively proved myself to me, if that makes any sense, because I in no way would be the artist I am if it wasn't for how much I drew during those first few seasons, because I was drawing in my school books and my notebooks and everything I could get my hands on.
Yeah.
And I had before that point never drawn as much, maybe How to Train Your Dragon, but not as often and as much as I did. And art comes with practice, so that sort of lighting the flame of forcing me to practice so much. I almost can't even be like, oh, and this is where I start to get good. Like, it was just kind of a landslide into the creative confidence I have now, which is in my writing and my art. And now that I have those as a basis, branching out to other things like making videos with my art, and practicing some really base cinematography, because that's what I really enjoy. So.
And it was excellent. Like even though it was frame by frame in the video, there was no doubt how it would look if everything was filled in. Like, every angle, every scene flowed the way it needed to.
Good. Yeah. Okay. Good. That's something I've always been really enthusiastic about. Is storyboarding essentially is planning how things would look, but not quite having the resources yet to put it all together, but still giving people the impression of that I could, which again is another big creative confidence booster. So, I'm very comfortable with where I am, or where I've been brought by this roleplay in my writing and my art. So,
and it sounds like
that was a huge thing for me.
Yeah, and it sounds like in the early part of what you mentioned, it was like as you were writing yourself, your subconscious put things down onto paper.
Oh, absolutely.
That then came to fruition, and that's the same thing that hit me looking back on it, because I was like, yeah, Stone gets a self-insert, no big deal, and then I realized that every single one of my characters, with rare exception, was a self-insert of some facet of myself, and then realizing things that I was struggling with, that those characters' stories then taught me how to resolve the solution. So it was like getting a letter from myself from the past, how to fix a problem that I was having 4 or 5 years later. So yeah, subconscious is fun to play around with.
Well, you can only see it looking back
Yeah.
5-6 years later, so.
It's very, very unreal. Because it's hard to acknowledge that you did something when you have no conscious memory of doing it deliberately.
No idea that you're doing it,
right.
yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
none. So onto a slightly different topic, but something I was nonetheless curious about. The Warden's different forms, because we have seen... I realized that I don't think Stonegate ever saw the Warden in her Season 1 form.
Right.
Which is interesting because that's where the nickname Woodchuck came from. There was a drawing that you did with the Warden looking over her shoulder, and there was just something about the way her nose was drawn and the expression she was making that looked exactly like a groundhog when they just suddenly turn around and look at you if you're sneaking up on them. It's what it reminded me of, and so, we had two issues. One, Stonegate had never actually seen the Warden, and two, when he did, his sight was all fucked up.
Sure.
And then three, she didn't look like that after that. And I'll stand. I will stand by the Woodchuck nickname. I'll just say that he saw
it's adorable.
Right, a depiction of her or something, or even just a description, like she looked like a giant scary woodchuck, whatever.
Yeah.
But she looks so different between Season 1 to a more goat fae-like creature in Season 2 to the horrifying and amazing-looking porcelain 8-10 foot monstrosity that butchers anything in its path, filled with fire and swords and stuff that she holds in her ribcage.
Mm-hmm.
How did all of that go in your mind? What was the artistic creative process with that?
Oh, goodness. I actually believe I talked to Haddock about this during, art book development. And I'm trying to recall my creative process there, because it was not as thought out as it looks, at least not at the beginning. And goodness me, I'll try and pull it up while I talk so I can have a reference for what I said, at least. It was just basically, I started out not knowing Tree Pelt and Ward were different, so I wanted to separate them and just figure it out. So it just came from doodling all over everything, basically, like I always do. And here it is. And I started to be like, oh, a demon would be really fun, because I've always had an interest in a creature that only exists in a ghost-like form or a mental form,
mm-hmm.
type thing. And I finally figured it out. I was like, I like this big cloaked cat-like figure because of Tree Pelt, but it's very obviously not her. And they sort of complemented each other, and then the season was over, and I'm like, that was fun. And then it kept going, so I was like, okay. So I've written myself into a very interesting situation here, because I basically was like, I don't want to just stick with one. Like, designing all these characters was so fun. I want to keep doing it. So I was like, well, shit, where do I go from here? So I decided to make the load a little bit easier on myself. I was like, okay, I'll take lots of traits from her vessel, her person that she's possessing. So I, for example, her black eyes, because Stonegate was mostly blind at the time, and just a more human-like form, because Stonegate wasn't a half-breed. And I think my most thought went into Stonegate's form, and then past to that, things sped up a little bit, so I didn't have as much time to put in as much thought. But I did have just a set of designs that I sort of picked out when I needed them.
Mm-hmm.
Probably Stonegate's form and Vox's Warden form were the most thought put into them, and the rest of them just kind of looked neat.
So
But we're nonetheless still.
So
Yeah.
the warden, when she possesses someone, her image becomes something akin or complementary of that vessel.
Yes, yeah, she takes
Interesting.
very
Okay.
influence from the vessel she is possessing. And I played with that even more leaning into Battleground and Dungeon 2 because I had her possessing Liam from a younger age, but now he's in his 20s, and I played with the idea that her form would shift with not major personality change, but he's older and he is a different person than he was when he was
Right,
13,
he grew.
So I hope I've shared them before. I sort of upgraded her design to be still the same as it was when she was with him as a kid, but a little more mature, a little more wild, more fitting of the personality that fits. So it's a mixture of physical and mental appearances, I suppose, is how I end up designing her. And then her demon body is actually Austin's design mostly.
Really?
Very influent. It was 2 separate designs taken from the card game Magic the Gathering.
Mm-hmm.
And which he was very familiar at the time, and I was not. I just thought the art was cool. So he drew up this because she didn't get her body until later, and then his characters brought it to her. Her mom brought it to her, so he was like, I'll make up a design for you. You see if you like it, and then I loved it, and I took it, and I made it my own. But the very base idea of the giant body and the muscle and porcelain was definitely his. So another little creative load off of it. But that was nice because I did love designing all the astral forms, but I kind of ran out of main characters to possess, so I didn't really get to do that anymore. So I kind of, and then I also wanted her to have a physical form, so that's where that came into play. So.
Very cool. And speaking of Tez, why don't we go through another story that I'm sure everyone's going to love to hear. And that's taking the story of what was Tez the Nomad and Clover Muses becoming, the couple, to the development between Tez and Tree as best friends, to the connection through that interconnected story of the Muns, Tree and Tez, eventually ending up where you guys are today.
That's a fucking wild one.
That's why I asked. We need fucking wild stories.
I'm sure everyone's heard it at least once. Tez's Mun, Austin, did not join until the beginning of season 2.
Mm-hmm.
He wasn't in the fandom, so he wasn't seeing any of this, but he was friends with Jordan, with Vox. So, and they both live up here where we are now in Montana, and they went out to, oh Lord, I think it was dinner. I think it was a late night Denny's run.
Yeah,
is what they were doing.
That's a great place to get stabbed. So props to you guys for having. You guys have balls of steel. I'm jealous.
It's this little tiny Denny's tucked away inside a truck stop, and they went out, and Jordan was, of course, embroiled in it at the time. So he showed Austin the threads and everything that was going on, and Austin is a lover of world building and story himself. I don't think he roleplayed before that, but he definitely was into writing and stuff, and he'd seen the How to Train Your Dragon movie, so he had a basis of what was going on. So he just kind of showed up one day in the chat, and we were like, "Oh, it's Jordan's friend," and I could see him trying to get a foot in the door with he had like a couple of one-shots that he wrote with Tez being stuck in the dungeon, and I was like, I have to help him. Like, I really want him to.
A new Mun shows up. Someone ought to go out of their way to thread with them, because that's just how things ought to happen.
Yeah, and I saw he was trying to do some really neat stuff. I'm like, oh, he's stuck in the dungeon. I'll go get him. And then we sort of integrated him in the story, and he joined the Witch Hunters, and he was with Kiri and Star-Lord and Clover a lot.
Right.
And then that's where Clover had started, so... but outside of that, we just mostly hung out in the group chat, and then we did Skype chats a lot. I can't remember. We hopped so many group chats. We would live stream
Oh
chat,
my gosh,
and then
yeah.
it was Skype, and then it was hip chat. So we got each other Skype, and then we would talk on Skype, and then we would, FaceCam chat on Skype all the time. And so it just turned into really, really, really good friends, and I was going through a ton of big changes at the time. Like, I was finishing high schools, I was, learning how to drive, going off to college, working my first few jobs, all these things. And so when I left for college, he was still there because he was in, I don't remember where he was at the time, he moved to.
It was somewhere.
Yeah, it was somewhere. It was somewhere in the U.S. And so we were still friends through basically the whole time I was there. And I went through a lot of, really rough stuff during all of that. Just basically just figuring out that I was not ready for college at all was basically the big rounded off lesson of that section of my life, due to a whole heaping load of personal factors. But he was pretty much always there for me. And then we met in person for the first time when we planned to, because he and his current significant other at the time and Haddock all lived in Colorado, so they were like, we should come visit, what would be a good time to visit. And there was a con coming up, like an off-season con in Salt Lake City.
Okay.
So we were like, sure, let's go do that, because I'd been to the bigger one before with my cousin who was gone, so I didn't really, that was the other thing too, is I didn't have a roommate at the time, so I was very alone for that section of college, which was fun in and of its own, but also I was by myself pretty much all the time, so
I feel that
was really good. So they drove all the way down. They almost got stopped because of a snowstorm. They drove all the way down, and we saw each other for the first time in the parking lot of a Super 8 motel, which was super fun. And then that's where I also saw Haddock for the first time, was going back up to the hotel room, and we went to the mall, we got food, we went to the con, and the whole shebang, and it was a really fun weekend, and just made us better friends. And just basically through the course of the rest of that, he broke up with his significant other, and then was like, hey, I think a few months after that, he was like, hey, I think I like you. And I was like, oh no, what do I do? I did, and what surprised me was my answer wasn't, okay, that's neat, but I'm not interested. I was like, oh, okay. And I was, going through a lot of changes at the time, and, not to get super
right. This would have been
member,
another big change right on top of it.
It was massive, and at the time I was basically I had to quit college. All I was doing was just staying in one of the student dorms, sort of undercover, just saying that I was still going there. They didn't check, but
oh.
So I could still get the student housing. I was just staying in one place, I was basically just working, trying to figure out what to do next. And he tells me this, and I'm like, oh shit, okay. And so I was like, I'll sit on it, and I told him to sit on it for way too long. But he was extremely patient with me figuring out my feelings and figuring out the fact that he was not a member, so I would have to figure out how to make this work. And so I just kind of sat down, and I was like, I really want to be happy. So I sat down and just thought about things, and I was like, I want to do this for me. I want to, if I don't do this, I feel like I'm missing something that's going to be very important. So I was like, you know what, screw it, we'll just do this. So we became boyfriend and girlfriend, and then we were dating, and then because we were already best friends, it just was really great.
That's all. I mean, and that's an excellent way to get things to have when you're already best friends or good friends with someone.
It was one of the best ways it could have happened. Like, I don't think there's anything about it that could have gone better besides how long everything took. Even it was still fine because it let me, because I was going through a lot at the time. I had to take a lot of time to sit down and just think. So by the end of like fall, I was like, you know, I am probably gonna be here for a while. I don't want to just sit here and wait in Utah for just something to happen. And so he was like, well, just come live up here. And I was like, sure. So we made plans, and then we packed all my stuff up, and at the end, or the beginning of December, and he came down, and then he proposed to me. So
no
we got engaged.
way.
Yeah, no, it was like a planned thing. So we were like, it should happen at least while I'm in Utah, or when we get back up here, like somewhere around there. Because by this time we were like, we're best friends. Like, we're gonna have to do this. Just like, you know. So
that is amazing.
We just enjoyed each other that much. So he came down and proposed, and we packed all my stuff up in the car and drove all the way up to where he lived, and basically here we are.
And that is,
it's been, yeah.
For as much as everyone is a fan of Lost Pelt in the story, I think everyone's just as big of a fan as you and Austin in real life, and that is a beautiful thing.
And it wasn't like, oh, I always knew it was gonna happen. Like, there was a possibility of like, okay, we're guy and girl best friends, like, blah blah blah, like, are you really just best friends with him, a type thing. And it bugged me when people said that, because like, of course I was.
Right.
And so we did end up together, but like that section of just being really good friends was really important to me. And and everyone in the roleplay, I think, was trading around significant others a lot, either within the roleplay or outside of it. So it was never a very linear thing, as Battle of the Grounded Dungeon is never anymore.
Yeah.
So
even like, it never really. There was like a little while where things started to get pretty linear and scripted, and then I think King was like, hey, we should stop doing this, and everyone was like, hey, you're right, and it went buck wild again.
Yeah.
It went buck wild again. It was great. Now, because we've hit the hour mark, but there's still probably plenty to talk about, I'm going to wrap this up, but under the pretense of there's still more that I think that we could cover with your characters and the journey with Battle of the Grounded Dungeon, and certainly subject matter regarding Battle of the Grounded Dungeon 2. So I would not be opposed of doing another episode with you guesting when we get an opportunity. But I do have one last question before we sign off. So, throughout the entirety of the adventure, was Austin ever hot enough that you found yourself saying damn and then calling the police and the fire department as a result?
Son of a bitch. God damn it. God, I can see your face. Stop it.
You don't even know what my face looks like.
I know exactly what your face looks like.
No, you haven't seen you haven't seen a recent picture of me enough for you to actually know what my face looks like.
Whatever.
Although hopefully, one of these days we'll do video calls and I'll do something, like that, and
sure.
Then you will
see
my face. But at the time being, you can't actually see this, so you're good.